The overhead fluorescent lights of Denver International Airport flickered slightly as travelers rushed past gate C-42, their rolling luggage clattering against the polished floor. It was a Tuesday morning, the kind where businessmen gripped their coffee cups with desperation, and families juggled strollers, diaper bags, and the hopes of making their connection on time. But amid this sea of ordinary chaos, one woman stood out, not because of what she was doing, but because of what she was about to do. Her name was Patricia Hendricks, though the airport staff would soon come to know her by a different name entirely. She wore oversized sunglasses despite being indoors, a flowing burgundy cardigan that seemed just a touch too theatrical, and she leaned heavily on a wheelchair that airport services had provided just 20 minutes earlier. Her lips were pressed into a thin line of determination, and if you looked closely, you could see her eyes darting back and forth behind those dark lenses, calculating, measuring, planning. This wasn't Patricia's first time pulling something like this, and she had perfected the art of appearing helpless while being anything but. The departure board above clicked and shuffled, announcing delays and gate changes in that distinctive airport font that somehow manages to look urgent and boring at the same time. Patricia's flight to Los Angeles was boarding in 30 minutes, and she had watched with growing irritation as the priority boarding line grew shorter, while the general boarding line stretched back like a snake. She had tried to board early, claiming she needed extra time, but the gate agent, a young woman named Maria with kind eyes and an unfortunately strict adherence to policy, had politely but firmly asked for documentation of her disability. Patricia had none, because there was no disability. She was as capable of walking as any other 52-year-old woman who attended yoga classes 3 times a week and hiked every Sunday. But Patricia had learned long ago that the world rewarded those who took what they wanted, not those who waited patiently for their turn. So she had made a scene, right there in front of gate C-42, her voice rising to that particular pitch that makes every head in a crowded space turn simultaneously. She clutched her chest, stumbled backward with practiced precision, and gasped about her heart condition, her severe arthritis, her recent hip surgery that still left her in agonizing pain. Other passengers had looked alarmed. A few stepped forward to help, and within minutes, an airport employee had arrived with a wheelchair and profuse apologies. Patricia had smiled weakly, playing the role of the brave sufferer, accepting assistance with trembling hands and whispered thanks. The young gate agent, Maria, had looked uncertain, clearly torn between policy and compassion, but she had ultimately allowed Patricia to use the wheelchair and promised her priority boarding once the flight was ready. Patricia had won round 1, and the small thrill of victory coursed through her veins like electricity. What Patricia didn't know, what she couldn't possibly have known in that moment of self-satisfied triumph, was that airport security had been watching her long before she ever collapsed at gate C-42. The security center for Denver International Airport sits in a windowless room on the 3rd floor of the main terminal, filled with dozens of monitors that show every angle of every gate, every walkway, every bathroom entrance, and baggage claim. It's the kind of room where nothing goes unnoticed, where trained eyes catch the subtle inconsistencies that separate genuine emergencies from manufactured drama. And Patricia Hendricks had been on their radar since she entered the airport an hour ago, walking briskly through the main entrance, striding confidently to the check-in counter, and moving with the ease of someone who had absolutely no physical limitations whatsoever. Security Officer James Chen had been the first to notice her, his attention caught not by anything she did, but by the way she moved, the purposeful stride, the lack of any visible discomfort. He had made a mental note, tagged her image in the system, and continued monitoring the feeds. When the call came through about a medical incident at gate C-42, James had pulled up the footage immediately, and what he saw made him lean forward in his chair. There was Patricia, mid-stride, walking normally, when suddenly she glanced at the long boarding line, looked at the priority lane, and then, as if someone had flipped a switch, she stumbled and grabbed her chest. The performance was good. James had to admit that. She had clearly done this before. But what she didn't realize was that airports are covered in cameras, hundreds of them, and they don't lie. James marked the footage, sent a message to his supervisor, and decided to keep watching. If Patricia was running a scam, she was about to discover that Denver International Airport had seen every trick in the book, and they had very little patience for people who exploited disability services. Back at gate C-42, Patricia sat in her wheelchair looking pleased with herself. She had positioned herself right at the front of the priority boarding line, and she could see the envious glances from passengers still waiting in the regular queue. A businessman in an expensive suit checked his watch repeatedly, clearly frustrated by the delay. A young mother tried to keep her toddler entertained with a tablet while juggling an infant in a carrier. An elderly couple held hands, their faces showing the exhaustion of early morning travel. None of them would board before Patricia, and that thought filled her with a sense of power that she found intoxicating. She had learned years ago that society's rules were really just suggestions, guidelines for people who lacked the creativity and courage to bend them. She had used fake medical emergencies to cut lines at theme parks, claimed allergies she didn't have to get better restaurant seating, and even fabricated a service dog certification online to bring her perfectly ordinary poodle into stores that otherwise wouldn't allow pets. Each time she got away with it, the tactics became easier, the lies more elaborate, the sense of entitlement more deeply rooted. An airport announcement echoed through the terminal, reminding passengers about suspicious behavior and the importance of reporting anything unusual to security. Patricia barely heard it. She was too busy planning her next move. Once on the plane, she would need to maintain the act, at least until takeoff. She had already decided she would need assistance getting to her seat, which meant she would likely get an upgrade to a bulkhead row with more legroom. She might even ask for a blanket and pillow, citing her chronic pain. The flight attendants would accommodate her. They always did, because nobody wanted to be the person who denied help to someone who appeared disabled. It was a perfect system, and Patricia had exploited it dozens of times without consequence. But 20 feet away, gate agent Maria was having doubts. She had been working for the airline for 3 years, and she had seen her share of difficult passengers, medical emergencies, and policy violations. Something about Patricia's sudden collapse hadn't sat right with her. The woman had been walking fine when she first approached the counter. Maria was certain of that. She had moved with confidence, her stride steady, her posture upright. The transformation had been too sudden, too theatrical. Maria had learned to trust her instincts in this job, and right now, her instincts were screaming that something wasn't right. She glanced at the wheelchair where Patricia sat, looking every bit the fragile patient, and then she made a decision. She picked up the phone at her desk and called airport security. In the security center, James Chen answered on the first ring. Maria explained her concerns, her voice low so as not to be overheard by nearby passengers. James listened carefully, asked a few clarifying questions, and then told her to proceed with boarding as normal, but to keep Patricia at the gate for as long as possible. He had a plan, and it involved showing everyone in that terminal exactly what Patricia had been doing for the past hour. He pulled up the surveillance footage again, this time creating a timeline of Patricia's movements from the moment she entered the airport until her dramatic collapse. What he saw was even more damning than he expected. The footage showed Patricia entering through the main doors at 7:45 in the morning, moving at a brisk pace. She stopped at a coffee shop, ordered a large latte, and walked to a seating area where she sat down and pulled out her phone. For the next 15 minutes, she appeared to be texting or scrolling through social media, occasionally laughing at something on her screen. At 8 o'clock, she stood up, gathered her belongings, and walked to the check-in counter. Her gait was completely normal. No limping, no hesitation, no sign of pain or difficulty. She checked her bag, received her boarding pass, and proceeded through security. The security footage showed her lifting her carry-on bag onto the belt with ease, walking through the metal detector without assistance, and collecting her items on the other side. She even jogged slightly to catch up with her bag as it moved down the conveyor belt. After clearing security, Patricia had walked to a restaurant near her gate and ordered breakfast. The footage showed her sitting at a high table, the kind without back support, and she sat there for 20 minutes eating a croissant and drinking orange juice, using her phone constantly. When she finished, she stood up, paid her bill, and walked toward gate C42. It was only when she was about 50 feet from the gate and could see the long boarding line that her demeanor changed. She paused, looked around as if checking whether anyone was watching, and then she glanced down at her phone one more time. James zoomed in on the timestamp. This was 8:43 in the morning. At 8:45, Patricia had her medical emergency. James compiled the footage into a single file, highlighting the key moments where Patricia walked normally, lifted luggage, sat without difficulty, and moved with the ease of someone in perfect health. He sent the file to his supervisor with a recommendation for immediate intervention. Airport policy was clear on this matter. Faking a disability to gain boarding priority wasn't just unethical, it was potentially criminal, as it involved making false statements to airport staff and potentially filing fraudulent medical claims. The supervisor, a no-nonsense woman named Captain Rodriguez, who had worked in airport security for 15 years, reviewed the footage and made her decision in less than 2 minutes. She contacted the gate agent, the airline supervisor on duty, and 2 uniformed security officers. Patricia Hendricks was about to have the worst flight boarding experience of her life. At gate C42, the boarding process had begun. The airline agent made the announcement for passengers needing assistance, along with first-class passengers and elite status members. Patricia smiled to herself, gripping the arms of her wheelchair as an airport employee came over to assist her. The young man, wearing a bright yellow vest that marked him as airport personnel, asked if she was ready to board. Patricia nodded weakly, putting on her most pained expression. She made a soft groaning sound as he began to push the wheelchair toward the gate entrance, and she noticed several passengers watching her with sympathy. The businessman who had been checking his watch earlier gave her a small nod, and the young mother with the toddler said something to her child about being grateful for good health. Patricia soaked it all in, the attention, the sympathy, the validation of her deception. But as they approached the gate entrance, something unexpected happened. 2 security officers appeared, their uniforms crisp and official, their expressions neutral but alert. They politely but firmly asked the airport employee to stop pushing the wheelchair. One of the officers, a tall man with graying temples and the bearing of someone who had seen everything twice, looked down at Patricia with eyes that seemed to see right through her oversized sunglasses. He introduced himself as Officer Morrison and asked if she could come with them to answer a few questions. Patricia felt her stomach drop, but she quickly recovered, her mind racing through possible explanations and escape routes. She put a trembling hand to her chest and asked in a weak voice what this was about, whether there was a problem with her boarding pass or her luggage. Officer Morrison's expression didn't change. He explained calmly and clearly that there were some inconsistencies that needed to be addressed before she could board her flight. Patricia's mind went into overdrive. Inconsistencies? What inconsistencies? She had been careful, hadn't she? She ran through her performance in her head, trying to identify where she might have slipped up, but she couldn't think of anything. She had been perfect, or so she thought. She protested, her voice rising slightly, demanding to know what right they had to detain her when she was clearly in need of medical assistance and had a flight to catch. Other passengers were starting to stare now, some with concern, others with curiosity. The businessmen looked annoyed at the delay. The young mother seemed worried. The elderly couple exchanged glances that suggested they had seen this kind of drama before. The second security officer, a woman with sharp eyes and an expression that suggested she suffered no fools, stepped forward. She explained that they weren't detaining Patricia. They were simply asking her to come with them to verify some information. It would only take a few minutes, she said, and if everything checked out, Patricia would be able to board her flight without further delay. But the way she said it, the tone of her voice, and the set of her shoulders, made it clear that this wasn't really a request. Patricia felt trapped. If she refused, she would look suspicious and might actually be detained. If she went with them, she might be able to talk her way out of whatever they thought they knew. She decided to play the victim card harder, letting out a small sob and saying that she couldn't believe she was being treated this way when all she wanted was to visit her sick daughter in Los Angeles. Officer Morrison remained unmoved. He gestured toward a door marked "Airport Personnel Only" about 30 feet from the gate. Patricia realized she had no choice. She nodded weakly, and the airport employee who had been pushing her wheelchair looked uncertain, glancing between Patricia and the security officers. Officer Morrison thanked him and said they would take it from here. He moved behind the wheelchair and began pushing Patricia toward the door, the female officer walking alongside. As they moved away from gate C42, Patricia could feel dozens of eyes on her back. She kept her head down, maintaining her act, but inside panic was starting to build. What did they know? How much had they seen? They entered a small office just off the main terminal corridor. It was a functional space with a desk, a few chairs, and a wall-mounted monitor that was currently displaying the airport security seal. Officer Morrison positioned the wheelchair facing the desk and then walked around to stand beside his colleague. For a long moment, nobody spoke. Patricia fidgeted in the wheelchair, her mind racing. The silence was oppressive, deliberate, and she recognized it as an interrogation tactic. They were waiting for her to break, to start talking, to defend herself before they had even made an accusation. She had watched enough crime shows to know how this worked. She decided to stay quiet, to wait them out, to see what they actually had before she said anything that might incriminate her. Officer Morrison finally broke the silence. He explained that airport security monitors all areas of the terminal and that they had been observing Patricia since she entered the building that morning. Patricia felt her blood run cold. They had been watching her the entire time, but she forced herself to stay calm, to keep her expression neutral. She had done nothing illegal, she told herself, so she had exaggerated some symptoms to get priority boarding. That wasn't a crime, was it? Officer Morrison continued, his voice professional but with an edge of disappointment that somehow made Patricia feel worse than outright anger would have. He explained that faking a disability or medical emergency to gain preferential treatment was a serious matter, that it took resources away from people who genuinely needed assistance, and that it violated both airline policy and federal regulations regarding false statements to airport authorities. Patricia's first instinct was to double down on the lie. She raised her voice, demanded to know how they dared accuse her of faking anything, insisted that she had genuine medical conditions, and that this was discrimination against disabled passengers. She reached for her purse, saying she had documentation, though she knew perfectly well that she didn't. But before she could continue her performance, the female officer, who had been silent until now, stepped forward and did something that made Patricia's entire act crumble in an instant. She picked up a remote control from the desk, pointed it at the wall-mounted monitor, and pressed play. The security seal disappeared, replaced by surveillance footage. Patricia's face appeared on the screen, and she watched in growing horror as the video showed her entering the airport that morning, walking normally, striding confidently. No wheelchair, no limp, no sign of distress. The footage continued, showing her at the coffee shop, at the check-in counter, going through security. In every frame, she moved with the ease and confidence of someone in perfect health. The video then cut to footage from gate C42, showing the moment she glanced at the boarding lines, checked her phone, and then, after a brief pause, suddenly collapsed and clutched her chest. The contrast was damning. The evidence was irrefutable. Patricia had been caught completely and thoroughly by the very cameras she had never thought to look for. The color drained from Patricia's face. She tried to speak, to formulate some explanation, but her mouth opened and closed without sound. Officer Morrison crossed his arms, his expression a mixture of disappointment and stern resolve. He explained that this footage would be shared with the airline, and that Patricia had a choice to make. She could admit to what she had done, accept the consequences, which would likely include being banned from flying with this airline and possibly facing charges for making false statements to airport authorities. Or she could continue to deny it, in which case they would proceed with a full investigation that would involve reviewing all of her previous travel records to see if this was a pattern of behavior. Patricia felt the walls closing in. Her mind raced through the implications. If they looked at her travel history, they would find other incidents, other airports where she had pulled similar stunts. She had complaints filed against her at 3 different airlines, though nothing had ever come of them, because she had always managed to talk her way out, or because the staff hadn't wanted to deal with the paperwork. But this was different. This was video evidence. This was undeniable. She realized that her decades of getting away with manipulation and entitlement had finally caught up with her in the worst possible way. The female officer spoke again, her voice less stern now, almost disappointed. She explained that they saw this kind of thing more often than most people would think. Travelers who fake disabilities to cut lines, to get upgrades, to board early. Every single time someone did this, it made things harder for people who genuinely needed assistance. It meant that gate agents became more suspicious of legitimate disability claims. It meant that resources were diverted from real emergencies. It meant that the system that was designed to help vulnerable travelers became clogged with people gaming it for minor conveniences. Patricia had never thought of it that way. To her, it had always been a victimless crime, a clever way to beat the system. But sitting in that office, watching her own deception play out on the monitor, she felt something she hadn't felt in a long time. Shame. Officer Morrison asked Patricia directly whether she had any genuine medical condition that prevented her from walking or standing in line. Patricia opened her mouth to lie, to say yes, to maintain the fiction just a little bit longer, but the words wouldn't come. She looked at the screen, at the evidence of her own manipulation, and she felt something break inside her. She shook her head slowly. No, she admitted quietly. She didn't have any medical condition. She had lied to skip the line. She had faked a collapse to get priority boarding. She had done it before at other airports, and she had planned to keep doing it because it always worked. Her voice was barely a whisper now, and she couldn't meet the officer's eyes. The room fell silent again, but this time the silence felt different. Less oppressive and more sad, as if even the security officers had hoped she would have a better excuse, a more understandable reason. Officer Morrison sighed deeply, the kind of sigh that carries years of dealing with human foolishness. He explained what would happen next. The airline had been notified and had made the decision to deny her boarding on today's flight. Her ticket would be refunded, but she was being placed on a no-fly list with this particular airline pending a review of her conduct. If the review determined that this was part of a pattern of fraudulent behavior, the ban could become permanent and could potentially be shared with other airlines. Additionally, because she had made false statements to airport staff about a medical emergency, the airport authority was within its rights to file a report with Federal Transportation Security, which could result in fines or criminal charges. Patricia felt tears prickling at her eyes, but they weren't tears of sadness or remorse. They were tears of frustration and anger at being caught, at having her carefully constructed system fall apart. She asked what she was supposed to do now, how she was supposed to get to Los Angeles to see her daughter. Officer Morrison's expression hardened slightly. He pointed out that she had just admitted that the story about the sick daughter was also likely fabricated, and that her pattern of lying made it difficult to believe anything she said now. Patricia started to protest, but realized he was right. She had lied about so many things that the truth, whatever it was, had become buried under layers of deception. The female officer pulled out a form and explained that Patricia would need to sign a statement acknowledging that she had made false claims about having a disability. This statement would be kept on file and could be used in future reviews or investigations. If Patricia refused to sign, the situation would escalate to law enforcement, and she could potentially be arrested for filing a false report and interfering with airport operations. Patricia looked at the form, at the cold legal language that would document her deception in permanent black and white. She thought about refusing, about demanding a lawyer, about making one last scene to try to turn this around. But she was tired. Tired of lying, tired of scheming, tired of the constant effort it took to maintain her web of deceptions. She took the pen and signed her name, her signature shaky and small. Officer Morrison collected the signed statement and filed it in a folder that already seemed to contain several other documents, possibly reports from other airports or complaints from previous incidents. He informed Patricia that she would be escorted out of the secure area of the airport and that she would need to collect her checked luggage from baggage services. The wheelchair would be returned to where it belonged, and Patricia would walk out on her own 2 perfectly functional legs. There was something almost poetic about that final detail, Patricia thought bitterly. She had used a wheelchair to try to cheat the system, and now she was being forced to demonstrate publicly that she never needed it in the first place. As they exited the office and began the walk back through the terminal, Patricia became acutely aware of her surroundings in a way she hadn't been before. Every camera mounted on the ceiling felt like an accusing eye. Every security officer they passed seemed to know what she had done. Other travelers moved around her, rushing to their gates, oblivious to the small drama that had just played out. But Patricia felt like she was walking a gauntlet, every step a public confession of her fraud. When they passed gate C42, she could see that her flight was in the final stages of boarding. The businessman was gone, presumably already seated on the plane. The young mother was walking down the jetway with her toddler and infant. The elderly couple was just presenting their boarding passes to the gate agent. They would all be in Los Angeles in a few hours, while Patricia would be explaining to whoever was expecting her why she never got on the plane. The walk through the terminal felt endless, but eventually they reached the exit from the secure area. Officer Morrison stopped at the security checkpoint and explained to Patricia that she would need to go to the baggage claim office to collect her checked luggage, which would be pulled from the flight. He handed her a slip of paper with information about the airline's refund policy and a website where she could read about the appeals process for the no-fly list designation. His tone was formal now, all business, the human disappointment from earlier replaced by procedural efficiency. The female officer added one final comment, her voice softer than before. She said that everyone makes mistakes, but the measure of a person is what they do after being caught. Patricia could choose to learn from this, to recognize how her actions affected others, and to become someone who contributes positively rather than taking advantage of systems designed to help people. Or she could continue down the path she had been on and face escalating consequences until something much worse happened. Patricia nodded, not trusting herself to speak. She walked through the security exit, officially leaving the secure area of the airport. The moment she stepped through, she felt the weight of what had just happened crash down on her. She had been so focused on maintaining her composure, on not making things worse, that she hadn't processed the full scope of the disaster. She was banned from her preferred airline, possibly facing federal charges, and she had been exposed as a fraud in the most humiliating way possible. Worse than any punishment, though, was the footage. That video of her walking normally and then faking a collapse would be in a file somewhere, accessible to security officials, airline staff, and potentially other airports if the ban was escalated to a broader no-fly list. Her face, her actions, her deception, all captured in perfect digital clarity. She made her way to the baggage claim area, her legs feeling shaky not from any medical condition, but from the aftermath of adrenaline and shock. The baggage office was a small counter tucked away near Carousel 5, staffed by a tired-looking man who barely looked up when Patricia approached. She handed him her baggage claim ticket and explained that her luggage needed to be pulled from a flight. The man typed something into his computer, frowned, and then gave her a look that suggested he had already been briefed on the situation. He told her it would take about 30 minutes to retrieve her bag and asked her to have a seat in the waiting area. Patricia sat down on a hard plastic chair that seemed designed to be as uncomfortable as possible, probably to discourage people from lingering. Around her, travelers collected their luggage and headed toward ground transportation or car rentals, their faces showing the full range of travel emotions from exhaustion to excitement. A family reunion was happening near Carousel 3, with balloons and welcome signs and excited children. A businessman argued with the baggage office about a lost suitcase, his voice escalating as he explained how important the contents were. Life at Denver International Airport continued exactly as it always did, completely indifferent to Patricia's personal catastrophe. As she sat there, Patricia's phone buzzed with a text message. It was from her sister in Los Angeles, asking what time her flight was landing so she could pick Patricia up from the airport. Patricia stared at the message, her thumb hovering over the keyboard. How was she supposed to explain this? She couldn't tell her sister the truth, that she had been caught faking a disability and had been kicked off the flight and banned from the airline. But she also couldn't keep lying, not after what had just happened. The weight of all her deceptions, built up over years of cutting corners and gaming systems, suddenly felt crushing. She typed a short message saying that her flight had been canceled and she would need to reschedule, then put her phone away before her sister could respond with follow-up questions. 35 minutes later, the baggage office clerk called her name. Patricia retrieved her suitcase, the same bag she had checked that morning when she thought she was being so clever, when she thought she had figured out how to beat the system one more time. She wheeled it toward the exit, past the security checkpoint where families said goodbye to travelers, past the car rental counters and shuttle bus signs, out into the cool Colorado morning. The automatic doors closed behind her with a soft whoosh, and she stood on the sidewalk, unsure of what to do next. She couldn't get another flight until she sorted out the airline situation, and she had no idea how long that would take. She pulled out her phone and started searching for hotels near the airport, her mind already calculating costs and trying to figure out how she would explain the additional expenses. But something made her stop. Maybe it was exhaustion. Maybe it was the shock of being caught so thoroughly. Or maybe it was the female officer's words about everyone making mistakes, and what matters is what comes after. Patricia sat down on a bench near the taxi queue, her luggage beside her, and for the first time in years, she let herself really think about what she had become. When had it started, this pattern of lying and manipulating? She could trace it back to small things in her 20s, little white lies that got her out of speeding tickets or late fees. Then bigger deceptions in her 30s, calling in sick to work when she wasn't, exaggerating accomplishments on her resume. By her 40s, it had become second nature, an automatic response to any situation where following the rules seemed inconvenient or disadvantageous. She had become someone who believed that the rules didn't apply to her, that she was smarter than everyone else. The consequences were things that happened to other people. And now here she was, sitting on a bench outside Denver International Airport, banned from flying with her preferred airline, possibly facing federal charges, and carrying the knowledge that somewhere in an airport security database, there was video evidence of her fraudulent behavior that could follow her for years. The karmic justice of it was almost poetic. She had spent years taking advantage of systems designed to help vulnerable people, and now she was the vulnerable one, stuck in a city she didn't live in, unable to get home the way she had planned, facing consequences that she had always believed she could avoid. A taxi driver approached and asked if she needed a ride. Patricia looked up at him, this stranger offering help, and she felt a sudden urge to be honest for once. She told him she wasn't sure where she was going yet, that she needed a few minutes to figure things out. The driver nodded understandingly and moved on to help another traveler. Such a simple interaction, but it felt significant somehow. She had told the truth, even about something as small as not knowing where she was going, and the world hadn't ended. The driver hadn't judged her or pressured her or demanded explanations. He had simply accepted her answer and moved on. Patricia pulled out her phone again, and this time, instead of looking for hotels, she opened her messages and looked at her sister's text. She took a deep breath and typed out a longer message, one that came closer to the truth than she had gotten in years. She explained that she had made a mistake, that she had tried to cut corners and had been caught, and that she wouldn't be able to visit as planned. She didn't go into all the details, but she was honest about having done something wrong and facing consequences. She hit send before she could talk herself out of it, then sat back against the bench and waited for the response. It came faster than she expected. Her sister's reply was surprisingly understanding, saying that everyone makes mistakes, and that she hoped Patricia was okay. She offered to help if Patricia needed anything, including money for a hotel or a rescheduled flight once things were sorted out. There was no judgment in the message, no demands for details, just simple human kindness. Patricia felt tears well up in her eyes, but this time they were different from the frustrated tears in the security office. These were tears of relief, of gratitude, of the strange comfort that comes from being honest and not having it blow up in your face. Back inside Denver International Airport, in the windowless security center on the 3rd floor, James Chen saved the footage of Patricia's incident to the permanent archive and added his final notes to the report. He had dealt with hundreds of situations like this over his years in airport security, and while each one was unique, they all shared common elements. Someone thought they could game the system, they got caught, and they faced consequences. What varied was what people did afterward. Some learned and changed, becoming better versions of themselves. Others doubled down on their deceptive behavior, getting more sophisticated in their schemes until they faced even worse consequences. James hoped Patricia would be in the first category, but he had learned not to count on it. Captain Rodriguez reviewed the report and approved its distribution to the airline security network, which would flag Patricia's name in various databases. It wasn't a full no-fly list in the traditional sense, but it meant that if Patricia tried to board a flight with certain airlines, her name would trigger additional scrutiny. If she stayed clean for a year or two and showed evidence of reform, the flags could be removed. But if she tried to pull similar stunts at other airports, the consequences would escalate quickly. The system had a long memory, and patterns of fraudulent behavior didn't go unnoticed forever. At Gate C42, Flight 2847 to Los Angeles pushed back from the gate right on schedule. The passengers settled into their seats, some sleeping, some reading, some staring out at the taxiways as the plane made its way toward the runway. The businessman from earlier opened his laptop and started answering emails, already moving on from the minor drama at the gate. The young mother finally got both children settled, the toddler with a coloring book and the infant asleep in her arms. The elderly couple held hands across the armrest, a gesture so natural and worn from repetition that they probably didn't even think about it anymore. None of them knew about Patricia, about what had happened after she was escorted away, about the security footage or the statement she had signed or the consequences she was facing. Their lives went on, intersecting with Patricia's story only briefly at that gate, and now diverging completely. Maria, the gate agent who had first suspected something wasn't right, finished boarding the flight and closed the door. She thought about Patricia for a moment, wondering what had happened after security took her away. She hoped the woman was okay, but also hoped she had learned something from the experience. Maria had been in situations before where she questioned her instincts, where she wondered if she was being too harsh or too suspicious. But her training had taught her to trust those instincts, and this situation had proven them correct. She made a mental note to include the incident in her next training report as an example of proper protocol. Then she moved on to her next flight, to the next gate, to the next group of passengers with their own mix of legitimate needs and potential schemes. The story of Patricia. Hendricks and her failed. Airport deception would become one of those cautionary tales that gets shared in training sessions and security briefings. It would be used to teach new airport employees how to spot inconsistent behavior, how to trust video evidence over emotional appeals, and how to balance compassion with accountability. The footage would be shown in seminars on airport security, with Patricia's face blurred out for privacy, but her actions left clear for instructional purposes. Her story would join thousands of others in the collective knowledge base of airport security, a reminder that cameras are everywhere, that deception rarely goes unnoticed, and that karma, especially in airports, has excellent surveillance equipment. As Patricia finally left the airport grounds in a taxi heading to a nearby hotel, she looked back at the distinctive peaked tent structure of Denver International Airport disappearing in the distance. She had entered that building a few hours ago as someone who thought she was clever enough to beat the system, someone who had spent years refining the art of manipulation and deception. She was leaving as someone who had been thoroughly exposed, who had faced consequences she couldn't talk her way out of, and who was being forced to confront the person she had become. What she would do with that confrontation, whether she would genuinely change or just get better at hiding her deceptions, remained to be seen. But one thing was certain. She would never look at an airport security camera the same way again, and she would never forget the feeling of watching her own fraud play out on that monitor, undeniable and inescapable. The taxi driver, unaware of his passenger's eventful morning, made small talk about Denver weather and asked if Patricia was visiting for business or pleasure. She found herself answering honestly that it was neither, that she had just had one of the worst days of her life and was trying to figure out what came next. The driver, bless him, simply nodded and said that sometimes the worst days are the ones that teach us the most, then turned up the radio slightly and gave her the gift of silence. Patricia watched the Colorado landscape roll by through the taxi window, hotels and office parks and suburban streets that all look the same, and she thought about the female security officer's words. The measure of a person is what they do after being caught. Patricia didn't know yet who she would choose to be, but for the first time in a long time, she was actually thinking about the question instead of automatically defaulting to deception. And back in the security center at Denver International Airport, James Chen was already monitoring the next situation, watching the feeds from dozens of cameras, looking for the subtle signs of trouble that most people never notice. Because airports never sleep, travelers never stop coming, and human nature, with all its creativity and all its flaws, continues to play out in endless variations under those fluorescent lights and security cameras. James had already moved on to tracking a suspicious individual at baggage claim who kept circling the carousels without ever claiming a bag, and to monitoring a heated argument at Gate B-17 between a passenger and airline staff. Patricia's incident was filed away, documented and archived, just another entry in the vast database of airport drama that accumulates every single day. 3 days later, Patricia was still in Denver. She had called the airline's customer service line 17 times, been transferred to 9 different departments, and spent a total of 6 hours and 42 minutes on hold, listening to the same looping message about how important her call was to them. Each representative she spoke with had access to her file, and she could hear the change in their tone when they pulled up her information, the way their helpful customer service voice would flatten slightly as they read the notes about her incident. The appeals process for the no-fly list designation was bureaucratic and slow, requiring written statements, documentation, and review by multiple levels of management. Her case had been flagged for legal review because of the false medical emergency claim, which meant additional delays while attorneys determined whether the airline wanted to pursue any civil penalties. The hotel room had become her temporary prison, a generic space with beige walls and abstract art that was clearly chosen to be inoffensive to the point of invisibility. She had watched more cable television in 3 days than she had in the previous year, flipping between news channels and old movies, anything to avoid thinking too much about her situation. Her sister had wired her money to help with the extended hotel stay, and Patricia had cried when the transfer came through, overwhelmed by kindness she wasn't sure she deserved. She had drafted and deleted a dozen different messages to her sister, trying to explain what had really happened. But each time the words felt inadequate, or too self-pitying, or not honest enough. On the 4th day, Patricia received an email from the airline's legal department. Her hands shook as she opened it, expecting the worst, preparing herself for news of criminal charges or massive fines or a permanent ban from all commercial aviation. But the email was more measured than she feared. The airline had completed its review and determined that while her actions were serious, they would not be pursuing criminal charges at this time. However, the ban from flying with their airline would remain in place for a minimum of 2 years, after which she could apply for reinstatement by providing evidence of reform and completing an ethics education program. The email included links to online courses about disability rights, the impact of fraud on systems designed to help vulnerable populations, and the federal regulations governing truthful statements to transportation authorities. Additionally, the Transportation Security Administration had been notified of the incident as required by federal protocol, and Patricia's name had been added to a watch list that would trigger additional screening procedures at all U.S. airports for the next 18 months. This didn't mean she couldn't fly, the email carefully explained, but it meant that she would be subject to enhanced security measures, including additional identification verification, more thorough bag searches, and possible interviews with security personnel. The email was signed by someone with the title Assistant General Counsel for Security Compliance, and the tone was professional but unmistakably firm. Patricia had gotten off relatively lightly, but she was being put on notice that any future incidents would result in far more severe consequences. Patricia read the email 3 times, absorbing each detail. 2 years. She couldn't fly with her preferred airline, the one she had accumulated miles with, the one whose routes served most of the cities she needed to visit, for 2 years. And even after that, reinstatement wasn't guaranteed. She would have to complete those courses, write some kind of statement about what she had learned, and convince someone in an office somewhere that she had genuinely changed. The enhanced security screening at all airports felt like a scarlet letter, a visible reminder every time she traveled that she had been caught doing something wrong. But beneath the frustration and embarrassment, Patricia felt something else. Relief. No criminal charges meant no court dates, no fines she couldn't afford, no criminal record that would follow her forever. She had been given a second chance, and she knew it. She clicked on the links to the ethics courses and started the first one, which was titled Understanding Disability Rights and Accessibility Requirements. The course began with statistics about how many Americans live with disabilities, how accessibility laws came to be enacted, and the daily challenges faced by people who need accommodations. Patricia had never thought about any of this before. To her, disability accommodations had been just another exploitable system, a set of rules that created opportunities for people clever enough to take advantage. But as she worked through the course material, reading first-person accounts from people with invisible disabilities who faced skepticism and discrimination, learning about the history of disability rights activism, understanding the careful balance between providing necessary accommodations and preventing fraud, she began to see the human cost of what she had done. One section of the course featured an interview with a gate agent who described the difficulty of determining which accommodation requests were legitimate when some passengers routinely lied to gain advantages, The agent explained how these fraudulent claims made them more suspicious of everyone, how they found themselves questioning people who genuinely needed help, and how that skepticism could create hostile and humiliating experiences for legitimate travelers with disabilities. Patricia thought about Maria, the gate agent at Denver who had ultimately called security, and wondered how many times Maria had been deceived before, how many fraudulent claims she had encountered that made her doubt Patricia's dramatic collapse. Another section included testimony from a woman with multiple sclerosis, an invisible disability that caused unpredictable symptoms. The woman described being accused of faking when she requested wheelchair assistance on bad days, having gate agents demand detailed medical documentation, being subjected to suspicious glares from other passengers who saw her stand up briefly from her wheelchair to retrieve something from an overhead bin. She talked about the emotional toll of having to justify her disability over and over, of being made to feel like a criminal for needing help, and of how the prevalence of people faking disabilities had made the system hostile to those who actually needed it. Patricia had to pause the video because she couldn't see the screen through her tears. She spent the entire day working through the first course, taking breaks only when the guilt and shame became too overwhelming. By evening, she had completed all 6 modules and passed the quiz at the end with a score of 94%. The system generated a certificate of completion with her name on it, and she saved it to her desktop, the first piece of evidence toward her eventual reinstatement application. But more than that, she saved it because it represented something she hadn't experienced in a long time. Genuine learning, real growth, an actual change in perspective, rather than just figuring out how to avoid consequences. The next morning, Patricia made a decision. She couldn't fly with her banned airline, but there were other airlines, and she needed to get back to her life, to her home, to some sense of normalcy. She pulled up flight search engines and started looking at options, finding a route that would get her back to Los Angeles with one connection through Phoenix. The ticket was more expensive than her original flight, and it was with an airline she rarely used, but it was available and it would get her home. She booked it, her finger hesitating over the confirm button for only a moment before clicking through. The next day, Patricia returned to Denver International Airport, but this time as a different person, or at least someone trying to be different. She checked in online, arrived 2 hours before her flight as recommended, and had all her documentation ready. When she went through security, her name did indeed trigger the enhanced screening protocol, just as the email had warned. A TSA agent politely asked her to step aside for additional verification, and Patricia complied without protest or drama. They checked her ID more carefully, swabbed her hands for explosive residue, and conducted a more thorough search of her carry-on bag. The agent was professional and efficient, and when they were done, they thanked her for her patience and cleared her to proceed. Patricia walked through the terminal with a strange mix of emotions. Everything looked the same as it had 5 days ago. The same shops, the same restaurants, the same endless announcements about unattended luggage and charging stations. But she felt different walking through it. She was hyper-aware of the security cameras now, seeing them everywhere, their dark lenses pointing in every direction. She noticed the accessibility features she had never paid attention to before. The wide gates for wheelchairs, the elevators with braille buttons, the visual and audio announcements for travelers with different needs. She saw a woman using a motorized wheelchair navigate through the crowd. And instead of seeing an opportunity to exploit, Patricia felt respect for the courage it must take to travel with a visible disability in a crowded, chaotic airport. Her gate was in Concourse B, and she had 90 minutes before boarding. She found a seat near her gate and pulled out a book she had bought in the hotel gift shop, but she couldn't concentrate on the words. She kept watching the other passengers, seeing them in a new light. The businessman who looked frustrated about something on his phone. Was he stressed about a meeting or dealing with a personal crisis? The young couple traveling with a baby who wouldn't stop crying. How exhausted must they be? How much courage did it take to attempt air travel with an infant? The elderly man who moved slowly through the terminal with a cane. What was his story? Where was he going? What had he lived through to get to this moment? When boarding was announced, Patricia waited for her group to be called. She didn't try to board early. She didn't claim any special accommodations. She simply waited her turn. And when her boarding group was called, she lined up with everyone else. The gate agent scanned her boarding pass, wished her a good flight, and Patricia walked down the jetway feeling like she had just accomplished something significant, even though all she had done was follow the normal procedure that millions of travelers follow every day. The flight to Phoenix was uneventful, and Patricia found herself grateful for the mundane normalcy of it. She had a middle seat, which she had always hated before, but today she accepted it as her due. The person in the window seat was a college student who slept through most of the flight. The person in the aisle seat was an older woman who was knitting something that looked like it might become a baby blanket. During the flight, the woman dropped her ball of yarn, and it rolled under Patricia's feet. Without thinking, Patricia picked it up and handed it back, and the woman smiled and thanked her. Such a small interaction, but it felt good to help someone without expecting anything in return, without calculating an angle or an advantage. During the layover in Phoenix, Patricia bought a sandwich at an airport cafe and sat at a table by the window, watching planes take off and land. She thought about all the flights she had taken over the years, all the times she had schemed and manipulated to get what she wanted. How much energy had she wasted on those deceptions? How much mental bandwidth had she consumed trying to game systems and avoid consequences? What could she have accomplished if she had channeled that creativity and determination into legitimate pursuits instead of fraudulent schemes? Her phone buzzed with a text from her sister asking what time her flight would land. Patricia responded with her arrival time and felt a wave of anxiety about seeing her sister in person. She had been vague about what had happened in Denver, sharing only that she had made mistakes and faced consequences. Her sister had been supportive from a distance, but Patricia worried about what would happen when they were face to face, when her sister might ask for more details, when Patricia would have to decide how much of the truth to share. The flight from Phoenix to Los Angeles was the last leg of her journey home. Patricia had a window seat this time, and as the plane descended toward LAX, she could see the sprawling city below, the grid of streets and highways, the geometric patterns of neighborhoods, the glittering ocean beyond. Somewhere down there was her sister waiting at arrivals. Somewhere down there was her apartment, her life, her routine. Somewhere down there was the future version of herself, the person she would choose to become after everything that had happened. The plane touched down smoothly, and passengers immediately started pulling out their phones, checking for messages, reconnecting with the ground-based world. Patricia waited until the seatbelt sign turned off, then gathered her belongings and filed off the plane with everyone else. She made her way through the terminal toward baggage claim, following the signs, moving with the flow of travelers. At baggage claim, she spotted her sister immediately, standing near Carousel 4 with a welcome sign that just said Pat, with a smiley face drawn next to it. Patricia felt her eyes well up at the simple kindness of it. Her sister hugged her tightly, and Patricia hugged back, holding on a moment longer than usual. In the car on the way home, her sister asked gently about what had happened in Denver, and Patricia took a deep breath and told her the truth. Not all the details, but the essential story. That she had tried to fake a disability to skip a line. That she had been caught on security cameras. That she had been banned from the airline and put on a watch list, and that she was now taking courses to understand the harm she had caused. She expected judgment, anger, or disappointment. Instead, her sister reached over and squeezed her hand and said, "Thank you for telling me the truth. That must have been hard." The weeks that followed were a process of adjustment and rebuilding. Patricia completed all the required ethics courses, spending hours learning about disability rights, accessibility laws, and the social contract that holds communities together. She wrote essays for the reinstatement application, reflecting on her actions and their consequences, articulating what she had learned and how she intended to change. The writing was harder than she expected because it required genuine introspection, rather than crafting excuses or spinning narratives. She also started therapy, recognizing that her pattern of deception and manipulation was rooted in something deeper than just wanting to skip lines. Her therapist helped her explore the underlying beliefs that had driven her behavior. The sense of entitlement, the conviction that rules were for other people, the fear of being ordinary or powerless. They worked on building healthier coping mechanisms and recognizing when she was slipping into old patterns of thinking. Patricia's story eventually faded from the immediate attention of Denver airport security, becoming just another case file in their extensive archives. But the footage remained, stored in databases, available for training purposes, a permanent record of her actions and their consequences. And in that permanence, there was a strange kind of accountability that Patricia found herself accepting rather than resenting. She had done something wrong. It had been documented, and now she had to live with that reality while working to become someone different. 6 months after the incident, Patricia had to travel for work. She booked a flight with a different airline, arrived early at the airport, and went through the enhanced security screening without complaint. The TSA agent who conducted her additional screening was professional and thorough, and when it was done, Patricia thanked her sincerely for doing her job. The agent looked slightly surprised by the genuine gratitude, but smiled and wished Patricia a good flight. As Patricia walked toward her gate, she passed a woman in a wheelchair waiting to board her flight. The woman was talking on her phone, explaining to someone that the airport had provided excellent service, and she should have no trouble making her connection. Patricia didn't know if the woman's disability was visible or invisible, permanent or temporary, and she realized that it didn't matter. What mattered was that the system was there to help her, that the accommodations worked, and that people like Patricia hadn't broken the system so badly that legitimate needs went unmet. Patricia boarded her flight in her assigned group, sat in her assigned seat, and took off toward her destination. It was an ordinary flight, unremarkable in every way, and that ordinariness felt like a victory. She wasn't scheming or manipulating or trying to get something she hadn't earned. She was just traveling like millions of people do every day, following the rules, respecting the systems, being part of the community, rather than trying to exploit it. The incident at Denver International Airport would always be part of her story, a moment of reckoning that divided her life into before and after. But what Patricia was slowly learning was that mistakes, even serious ones, don't have to define a person forever. What defines a person is what they do next, how they grow from failure, whether they use the experience to become better or just become better at hiding their flaws. Patricia was choosing, slowly and imperfectly, to become better. And somewhere in an airport security center, on a day much like any other, James Chen was monitoring his screens, watching for the subtle signs of deception, the inconsistencies that separate truth from performance. He would catch more people like Patricia, would review more footage, would write more reports, but he would never know about Patricia's therapy sessions, her completed ethics courses, or the small daily choices she was making to be honest instead of manipulative. He had done his job, caught the deception, enforced the consequences, protected the integrity of the system. What Patricia did with that wake-up call was beyond his jurisdiction, beyond his cameras, beyond his knowledge, but it wasn't beyond possibility. And that, in the end, was what mattered. Not that Patricia had been caught, though she had. Not that she had faced consequences, though she had. But that she had been given a chance to change, and she was taking it one honest decision at a time, one truthful interaction at a time, one flight at a time where she simply followed the rules and accepted her place in line like everyone else. The cameras at Denver International Airport had exposed her fraud, but they couldn't see into her heart, couldn't measure her growth, couldn't document the slow transformation happening in the quiet moments between the drama. That story, the one about redemption and change, wasn't captured on any surveillance system. It was written in choices too small for cameras to record but too important to ignore.